She woke up on a slow-moving train with no idea where it was headed, or who she even was. Her hands were trembling, and beside her sat a silent German shepherd with eyes full of knowing. No wallet, no name tag, just a photo of herself with the dog and a message on the back, "Don't forget where you belong." Emily, the young librarian who had never met Maggie before, couldn't yet know that the voice asking for poetry once belonged to a local legend. Ruth, Maggie's oldest friend and keeper of her absence, had no idea that the stranger in her quilt shop still hummed the tune they once sang while sewing. The boy on the bridge, holding a red journal he found beneath a bench, certainly could not realize it contained Lily's last drawing, signed, "For Mama." It all started with the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound, the kind you wake up into and somehow already know doesn't belong to morning. She opened her eyes not to the comfort of her own room, not to the distant hum of a familiar television or the scent of brewing coffee, but to the muted sway of a half-empty train car rolling somewhere across the American South. Her hand was still resting on the window, fingers curled like they had been clutching something important, and in her lap lay a folded square of cloth wrapped tightly around a dog-eared photograph. Beside her, stretched long and alert, was a large German shepherd with a coat like storm clouds and eyes that watched her as if they'd been doing so for a lifetime she had no memory of. She didn't remember getting on the train, didn't know where it had come from or where it was going, and when she tried to recall her name, only silence echoed back. Her pockets were empty, her shoes were worn, and her coat still held the faint scent of lavender, though she had no idea why that made her heart ache. She looked down at the photo, carefully unwrapping the cloth as if it were fragile, and saw two figures, a younger version of herself, smiling wide and full of life, and the same dog now laying beside her, sitting proud beneath the shade of a pecan tree. On the back, written in faded ink that had run slightly with age or perhaps tears, were the words, "Don't forget where you belong." She couldn't yet know that the dog sitting beside her was the only living being who still remembered who she truly was. She had no idea that the photo in her hand would be the key to unlocking a lifetime of forgotten faces and buried grief. And she certainly had no idea that every town on that quiet train line would offer her a piece of the woman she used to be. The conductor passed with a nod, saying nothing, as if she'd been on the train for days, or years, or perhaps since time itself stopped meaning anything to her. The train slowed to a gentle stop, dust kicking up outside the wide windows, revealing a sign so faded the letters could barely be made out, Cotton Bend. The woman hesitated, unsure of anything except the feeling that Shadow, the dog, had suddenly stood, ears perked and eyes locked on the door, as if to say, "This is where we begin." Without knowing why, without knowing who she was, she followed him off the train, each step feeling like a heartbeat echoing from another life. The air was warm, thick with the scent of magnolia and wood smoke, and somewhere far off, a wind chime sang a tune her memory couldn't name but her soul almost hummed along to. They walked down the platform in silence until a voice behind her called out gently, "Miss, excuse me, have we met before?" She turned slowly, hand resting lightly on Shadow's back, as if she needed the contact to stay balanced, in her body, in the moment, in this life she couldn't yet claim. And as she looked into the eyes of the stranger, something flickered behind hers, not recognition exactly, but the faint glimmer of a thread beginning to reweave itself. Before she could speak, the stranger asked softly, "Are you from here?" "Yes," she answered, though her voice came out thinner than she expected, as if the word didn't belong to her but to a stranger speaking through her lips. "I think, maybe I am." The man smiled kindly, the sort of smile that came from long years behind a counter or in a pew, the kind that didn't rush you, didn't need anything from you, just offered you a place to rest for a moment. "Well now," he said, tipping his head toward the center of town, "if you're from Cotton Bend, then you'll know where the apple pie always comes out first thing in the morning." He turned and began walking slowly, not looking back, as if he knew she'd follow, or hoped she would, and beside her, the German shepherd took a step forward, then another, as if this was the path he'd been waiting for all along. They walked together in silence, past peeling picket fences, cracked sidewalks overrun with tufts of clover, and yards where old porch swings creaked in rhythm with a breeze that carried the scent of something warm and familiar. The diner sat on the corner just like it had been planted there before memory began, the kind with a tin roof that rang when it rained and a bell above the door that jingled with a sound so soft it could have been a lullaby. Inside, time didn't seem to move at all, only folded itself gently into corners where old men sipped black coffee and the waitress still wore her name tag, even if most people already knew her name. And there, behind the counter, stood a woman with hair pinned up in a twist and hands that looked like they could knead bread in their sleep, hands that paused when they saw her. The woman set down a pie still steaming from the oven, her gaze catching and holding with a tenderness that stirred something under the surface, something that wasn't quite memory but wasn't just emptiness either. "Well, I'll be," she said softly, her voice trembling at the edges like paper caught in a breeze. "Maggie Monroe, is that really you?" The name settled over her like a worn coat found in an old closet, familiar in its shape but still strange on her shoulders, as if it belonged to a version of herself she hadn't met in years. She wanted to say yes, wanted to feel it click into place like a key in the right lock, but the silence inside her was still too loud, and so she just looked at the woman behind the counter and said, "I'm sorry. I don't know." The woman nodded slowly, wiping her hands on her apron like she was steadying herself against something that hurt more than it showed, and after a moment she came around the counter, taking cautious steps like one might toward a wild animal or a wounded friend. "You used to come here every Tuesday," she said gently, placing a hand on the edge of the table where the pie now rested. "You always sat at that booth by the window, and you always brought him with you." She looked down at Shadow, whose head now rested against her knee as if to anchor her to the place and the moment and perhaps to the name she still didn't recognize as her own. "I remember," the woman continued, her eyes softening, "he'd wait until your last bite, and then he'd lay his head in your lap, just like that, as if he knew when the story was done." And for the first time since waking up on that train, something inside her cracked, not painfully, not like a break, but like a frost-thawed branch giving way to the first breath of spring. She reached out and touched the edge of the pie tin, the warmth soaking into her fingers, and though she didn't yet remember the taste, she knew the smell, cinnamon and sugar and something that tasted like safety. Shadow stirred beside her, letting out a small sound, almost a sigh, and it reminded her of another sigh, long ago, maybe, on a porch or in a car, a sigh that had meant home. "I don't remember coming here," she said, her voice softer now, steadier, like a stream learning again how to move. "But I think I remember this pie." The woman behind the counter smiled again, this time with something behind it, not just kindness, but history. "You once told me it was better than your mama's, and that was the highest compliment you could give." Outside, the wind picked up just a little, and the bell above the door jingled again, though no one had come in. She looked back at the photograph still clutched in her coat pocket, feeling the edge of it through the fabric, and asked quietly, "Do you know where this picture was taken?" The woman behind the counter glanced at it, then raised her eyes slowly, a shadow crossing her face like a cloud drifting across the sun. "No," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But I think I know someone who might." And so began the quiet pause before the next breath of her journey, because in part 3, a man with trembling hands and a medal in a drawer would look at her face and say, "Don't you remember what you did for me?" "Yes," the woman said, still holding the photograph between two careful fingers, as if it might tear with too much breath. "He lives just outside of town, in the old white house near the railroad tracks. Folks call it the Crossroads House, on account of the way the freight lines used to split right there before the company rerouted the southbound route." She glanced toward the diner window, where the shadows had shifted and the dog waited patiently just beneath the table, his head raised slightly, ears perked as if he had heard the name before and understood what it meant. "I can drive you there," she offered, pulling a set of keys from the pocket of her apron, the kind of keys that jingle with more memories than doors, the kind that feel heavier in a quiet hand. The drive was short, winding past cotton fields that had long since dried and folded in on themselves for the season, past broken fences and trees leaning slightly with age, and all the while Shadow rode in the back seat with a steady gaze, watching the landscape as if searching for a sign his eyes would recognize before hers could remember. When they pulled into the driveway of the Crossroads house, the first thing she noticed was the American flag on the front porch, not new, not bold, but faded and familiar, like the kind that had been there through more than one war and didn't need to be replaced to prove anything. A man sat in a chair that creaked when he shifted, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbows and a ball cap too clean for someone who looked like he worked with his hands. He didn't stand when they approached, but he didn't seem surprised either, just blinked once, slow and deliberate, like a man who hadn't seen something in a long time but wasn't ready to say it out loud. The woman from the diner gave a small nod, stepped back toward her car, and said softly, "I'll give you two some time." Shadow moved first, stepping onto the porch without hesitation, walking straight to the man's boots and sitting, calm and still, as if this place had once been part of his world too. "I remember that dog," the man said, his voice deep and soft, the kind that carried a lifetime of things left unsaid. "He hasn't changed much, has he?" She sat down on the bench beside him, slowly, carefully, still holding the photo like a compass with no direction, and asked, "Do you know me?" The man smiled, but it wasn't the kind that came from joy, it was the kind that came from pain softened by time. "I do," he said simply. "But I think it's more important that I tell you how I remember you, not just that I do." He leaned forward, reaching under the bench into a weathered old tin box, the kind that used to hold Christmas cookies or sewing supplies, and pulled out a small velvet case that he held with a kind of reverence that made her breath catch. "I was lost when you found me," he began, opening the box to reveal a medal, not polished, but kept clean enough to gleam in the afternoon light. "Not just lost in the woods, though that too, but lost in a way a man doesn't like to admit, even to himself." She looked at the medal, unsure what to say, and he continued, "You brought me back that night. It wasn't with bandages or a stretcher. It was your voice. You just kept talking to me, soft like you do, even when I couldn't respond, even when I didn't want to come back." Her hands trembled slightly as they rested in her lap, her eyes stinging without warning, because something about the story, the way he said it, the weight of it, struck a chord deep inside her, even though the melody was still just out of reach. "I didn't remember your name at the time," he said, "but I remembered your hands. Steady as anything. And I remembered that dog. He sat beside me the whole time, wouldn't move, like he knew I was halfway between here and somewhere else and needed company for the road." She looked down at Shadow, who now lay stretched at her feet, tail tapping lightly against the porch as if acknowledging his part in a story she hadn't yet found her place in. "You wore a blue sweater that night," the man added, as if the detail had clung to him like the smell of smoke or the taste of winter air. "It had a tear in the left sleeve. I don't know why I remember that, but I do." She looked at the sweater she wore now, beige and unfamiliar, and wondered what had happened to the blue one, wondered what else had been torn in the years since, and whether anything could be sewn back together. He placed the medal in her hands, closing her fingers around it gently, and said, "I meant to give you this a long time ago. But by the time I worked up the nerve, you were gone." Her eyes filled then, not with memory, but with the ache of knowing someone had waited, had held on, had remembered when she had not. "I'm sorry," she whispered, not even knowing what for, only that the apology felt necessary, like a balm offered to a wound she couldn't yet name. He shook his head slowly, brushing a hand across his chin, eyes glistening with the weight of things held too long. "No," he said. "You came back. That's enough for me." And then he turned slightly, looking toward the road, his voice quieter now. "Do you remember the old bookshop next to the church in Marlow?" The name of the town echoed faintly in her ears, like a bell heard in a dream just before waking, and she looked up with a furrowed brow, searching his face for answers he couldn't give. "I think someone there still has your book," he said, standing slowly with the help of his cane. "Might be something worth finding." As she stepped off the porch, Shadow followed close behind, never needing a leash, never asking for permission, just being where she needed him, like he always had. And just before she turned to leave, she looked over her shoulder and asked gently, "What was the name of the book?" The man smiled one last time, tipping his cap as if offering her a piece of herself. "It was called The Language of Light," he said. "And I remember you knew every word by heart." "Yes," the young woman behind the counter said softly, her voice carrying the gentle timbre of someone raised around quiet things, books, candles, and stories that only made sense when spoken aloud. I remember the woman who loved the language of light. She came in every Thursday around 2 o'clock and always wore the same wide-brimmed hat with a little blue ribbon, even when the weather was gray. She looked at the photograph in the older woman's hand, then at Shadow, who stood at her side like a monument to patience and purpose, and something in her expression shifted, not recognition exactly, but the sort of respectful pause one gives a person who has clearly been carrying something heavy for a very long time. I kept your copy, the girl continued, moving through the narrow aisles with practiced ease, her fingers trailing across spines like she was reading the shelves by touch alone. You had a habit of underlining the last line of every chapter, always in pencil, like you weren't quite ready to commit to permanence. The bookstore itself smelled like old wood, lavender polish, and the paper-sweet scent of books that had lived longer than some marriages, and as they moved deeper into its quiet, dust-mottled corners, it began to feel less like a shop and more like a chapel built for the memory of thought. Shadow walked ahead, his nails tapping softly against the wooden floorboards, ears turning toward distant sounds, yet his body remained relaxed, not on alert, just aware, like a guardian who knew there were no monsters here, only shadows that needed coaxing into the light. The girl stopped in front of a shelf marked local favorites, her hand resting lightly on the spine of a well-worn book with a creased navy cover and a frayed ribbon tucked between its pages. I don't usually keep private orders this long, she said, carefully lifting the book and pressing it gently into the older woman's waiting hands, but I couldn't make myself put it back. Something told me you'd come for it again someday. The woman stared down at the title, The Language of Light, and felt something shift in her chest, not a memory exactly, but the echo of one, like hearing a melody played in another room and knowing, without question, that you used to hum it in your sleep. She opened the book slowly, letting the ribbon fall open to a page 3/4 of the way through, and found, underlined in soft, fading pencil, a sentence that made her throat tighten before she even finished reading it. We never really forget who we are, we only misplace the words that explain it. There, in the margin, was a note in handwriting that curled slightly to the right, warm and precise, for N, I'll find my way back. Her knees gave slightly, not from pain or fatigue, but from the overwhelming tenderness of that promise, written by a version of herself she didn't yet remember being, addressed to a person whose name felt like the very edge of a dream she couldn't quite pull into focus. The girl touched her arm gently, grounding her back to the moment with the care of someone who had watched people cry in her store before and knew when not to speak. That was your writing, she said simply. You told me once that poetry was your compass, that you trusted words more than maps. The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned the pages of the book slowly, letting her fingers move like they were retracing an old trail, one that led somewhere she had once called home. She stopped again near the end, where another passage was marked with 2 faint lines and a question written in the margin. Do you remember the picnic at Wildflower Hollow? Her breath caught, sharp and sudden, because though she couldn't see the place, couldn't recall the exact moment, she felt it, the rustle of grass under a blanket, the warmth of sun on bare forearms, the way laughter had sounded like wind chimes on a warm breeze. She looked down at Shadow, whose gaze had lifted toward the window, and then toward the door, as if he, too, had remembered something she hadn't yet spoken aloud. The girl noticed. Sometimes, she said, dogs carry things for us until we're ready to carry them ourselves. The woman nodded, one tear sliding down her cheek, unbidden and unhurried, leaving a trail as soft as a sigh. I think, she said quietly, clutching the book to her chest like it could anchor her in place, I used to believe in remembering. The girl smiled gently, her eyes kind but not pitying, the kind of smile that understood grief and its cousin, recovery. You still do, she said. You just forgot that you did. For a long moment, they stood in silence, surrounded by the whispers of stories long told and long kept, until the woman glanced once more at the note and asked, almost to herself, do you know who Anne is? The girl tilted her head slightly, then stepped behind the counter, returning with a faded business card, the kind printed on thick, grainy paper, and handed it over with a hesitant hand. He used to run the print shop next town over, she said. Nolan Price. He closed up a few years ago after, she paused, searching the air for a kinder word but finding none, after you left. The name landed with the soft weight of something sacred, and Shadow pressed gently against her leg, as if to say, yes. That's the one. She stared at the name, reading it again and again, not yet ready to speak it, but knowing deep inside that it was hers to speak someday soon. Then she looked up, her voice fragile but sure, and asked, where did he go when the shop closed? He didn't leave town, the woman in the quilt shop said, her voice barely louder than the creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet. He waited. And he still does. The shop was small, just big enough for its purpose, and it smelled like cotton thread, old cedar shelves, and the faint trace of rosewater, the kind of place where stories were sewn into fabric and stitched into corners nobody ever thought to look until time slowed down enough for reflection. Bolts of cloth lined the walls like silent sentinels, each bearing patterns that spoke softly of autumn porches, Sunday mornings, and hands that knew how to mend what had once been broken. The woman behind the counter looked to be in her 70s, with snow-white hair pulled back in a low twist and a face shaped by years of both loss and laughter, the kind that had learned to carry sorrow like a folded letter tucked into an apron pocket. She didn't rush her words, and she didn't seem startled by the question, only thoughtful, as if she'd been waiting for it, too, and knew that sooner or later someone would come walking through the door and ask about the man who still waited. Nolan Price lives 3 blocks down, just off Willow Street, she said, placing her hand gently on a folded quilt near the register, a quiet motion that seemed to contain more meaning than the words themselves. That's where he's always been. After you left, well, he stopped opening the shop, but he never stopped opening the curtains. The older woman, the one still chasing pieces of a self she hadn't fully met again, stood quietly in the doorway, her fingers grazing the edges of a faded patchwork quilt that hung beside the window like a hymn stitched in fabric. Shadow rested at her feet, patient as ever, his gaze following the shopkeeper's hand as she pulled the quilt from the wall and laid it across the counter with a care usually reserved for wedding dresses or christening gowns. You made this, the woman said softly, pressing her palm to the center square where initials had been hand-stitched in fine, looping thread. MP. That's you, isn't it? She nodded slowly, the sight of those letters sending a gentle tremor through her chest, not quite memory, but something like recognition breaking through thick fog. The quilt was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with symmetry or color, but everything to do with soul, small mismatched pieces sewn together with tenderness, some bright, some faded, a tapestry of forgotten afternoons and worn-out evenings turned meaningful by the simple act of hands moving needle through cloth. You used to come here every Tuesday morning, the shopkeeper continued, her fingers trailing across the stitched border with the same reverence one might give an old photograph. You never said much, but you always brought your own fabric, and you always asked to sit by the window. The older woman closed her eyes for just a moment, and in the darkness behind her eyelids, she felt warmth, not light exactly, but warmth, the kind that came from a shaft of sun falling through glass and landing across her hands as they worked. I think I remember the window, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear but from the delicate ache of returning to something long abandoned. And I remember the sound of scissors. Shadow leaned into her leg then, just the slightest pressure, as if affirming that the memory belonged to her and that he had been there, too, even if she couldn't place him inside the picture yet. The shopkeeper reached into a small drawer behind the counter and pulled out a pair of silver scissors, heavy, well-used, with worn grips and a faint engraving on the handle. You left these here, she said, offering them with both hands, the day you disappeared. The weight of them settled into her palm like a memory made solid, and as she held them, something shifted again inside her, a flash this time, sharp and clear, the sound of fabric tearing, a voice calling her name, and then silence. I don't know why I left, she murmured, eyes fixed on the scissors, as if the truth might still live in their cold steel. But I think I didn't mean to. The shopkeeper nodded slowly, not asking more, not pressing, just holding space the way only the oldest friends or the kindest strangers knew how. You sewed a lot of memories into that quilt, she said. Maybe you left so you wouldn't have to keep adding to it. Shadow's tail gave a slow, steady thump against the floor, and the sound seemed to echo in the quiet shop like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence she hadn't realized she was writing. She folded the quilt carefully, as if handling something sacred, and looked out the window, her gaze following the invisible thread that now seemed to stretch from one place to another, from the past she didn't remember to the man who hadn't forgotten. Why did he wait? She asked softly, not really expecting an answer, but needing the question to be spoken aloud, as if doing so made it real. The shopkeeper didn't hesitate. Because some people don't stop loving you just because you're not there anymore. The woman looked down at the initials stitched in the center of the quilt again, brushing her thumb across them as though trying to wake them up. Does he still talk about me? She asked, the question slipping out so quietly she almost didn't hear herself say it. The shopkeeper met her eyes gently, with the kind of knowing that can't be taught or faked. He writes you letters, she said. Every Sunday. He puts them in a drawer under his window. He doesn't send them, just writes. The air shifted then, something unspoken taking root in the silence between them, and the woman folded the quilt beneath her arm like someone reclaiming an old chapter not yet closed. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, and through the front window, a dog barked in the distance, not a warning, but a greeting. She turned back to the shopkeeper, her voice just above a whisper. Do you think he'll see me? And in part 6, a boy on a bridge, holding something she forgot she'd lost, will answer simply, he sees you already. He just doesn't know it's you yet. He sees you already, the boy said, his voice quiet and sure in the way only a child who knows secrets too big for his age can speak. He just doesn't know it's you yet. She turned toward him slowly, the sound of gravel shifting beneath her feet as she stepped onto the wooden planks of the old footbridge that arched gently over the narrow stretch of water known in this town simply as Hollow Creek. The boy couldn't have been more than 9 or 10, dressed in overalls that were one size too big and a t-shirt bearing the faded image of a high school mascot that hadn't roared in years. In his hands, held out carefully like something both precious and breakable, was a small red leather notebook, worn smooth at the edges from use, with a thin length of twine tied around it like a parcel waiting to be opened by someone who'd long since stopped expecting gifts. I found this, the boy said, eyes meeting hers with a seriousness that felt almost sacred, in the bench by the water tower, tucked under the seat like it had been hiding there a long time. Shadow stepped forward first, his paws landing softly on the creaking planks, ears flicking once toward the boy, then toward the creek below, where sunlight danced over the rocks like small golden ghosts trying to lead someone home. She reached for the notebook slowly, almost hesitantly, as if afraid touching it might awaken something she wasn't ready to see, yet her fingers moved with an instinct that felt older than memory, the way a pianist might reach for familiar keys in the dark. The moment her hand closed around the leather, she felt a shift, not just in her chest, but in the air around her, like the first gust of wind that comes before a summer storm, warm and heavy with the scent of change. There's a letter inside, the boy said, stepping back with the quiet wisdom of someone who had already done what was needed and would ask for nothing more in return. It's the only one that doesn't have a date. She untied the string and opened the notebook slowly, the spine cracking with the soft, tired sound of something that had waited too long to be read again, and inside the front cover, written in ink that had faded just slightly over time, was a single sheet of lined paper, folded neatly in thirds. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it, shadow pressing gently against her leg like a living anchor, and her eyes moved slowly over the words that filled the page, each one written in a hand she did not yet remember but recognized in the way one remembers a song's chorus long after forgetting the verses. Dear M, it began. If you ever find this, and Lord knows I don't expect you will, then maybe it means something inside you still knows the way back. I've written you a letter every Sunday since the day you left, even when I didn't know what to say, even when all I could do was write your name and stare at the blank page for an hour. Maybe I thought if I kept writing, you might hear me in the silence. She swallowed hard, the paper trembling now in her hands as her breath came slower, deeper, and she felt the first tear slip down her cheek without permission or warning. I never asked where you went. I just prayed you were somewhere you didn't hurt. That's all I ever wanted, for you not to hurt anymore. But if you're reading this, it means you came back. Or maybe you never left. Maybe you were just lost inside yourself. And if that's true, come home. That's all. Come home. The letter ended there, no signature, no closing, just the last two words underlined softly, like a whisper etched into the page by a man who had spoken those words aloud every morning for years until the echo became part of the walls around him. She pressed the letter to her chest, the paper fragile against her heart, and closed her eyes as a memory broke through the surface like the sudden cracking of winter ice, the image of hands brushing paint across a porch railing, the sound of a radio playing something old and familiar, the warmth of another hand in hers, steady, worn, and beloved. When she opened her eyes, the boy was no longer on the bridge, his absence as quiet as his presence had been, but Shadow remained at her side, watching her with a calm that held no urgency, only understanding. She looked down at him, placing her hand on his head gently, and whispered, "Did you know he was waiting?" Shadow blinked slowly, as if the answer lived in the silence between them, and turned his head toward the far end of the bridge, where the rooftops of the town could just be seen peeking above the trees. She stood for a long moment, the letter still pressed to her chest, and then asked aloud, more to herself than to anyone listening, "What if he doesn't recognize me?" And in part 7, an old friend with a memory sharper than her own will place a hand on her shoulder and say, "Then maybe it's time you remembered yourself." "Then maybe it's time you remembered yourself," the voice said gently behind her, calm and kind like a steady hand on the back during a long goodbye. She turned slowly, the sound of her steps softened by the worn wooden boards beneath her feet, and found herself looking into the eyes of a woman who stood with a cane in one hand and a look of long-held familiarity in the other. The woman's hair was the soft gray of early fog, pulled back into a loose bun that had once probably been tight and efficient, but now gave way to the gentle softness of time and age. "I saw you from the porch," the woman said, motioning toward a house nestled just past the edge of the bridge, its front gate hanging slightly off one hinge and a wind chime singing low and slow in the afternoon breeze. "And I knew it was you before you even reached the middle of the span." Shadow stood still beside her, unmoving yet fully alert, his gaze shifting between the two women as though guarding a fragile line of memory stretched taut between them. The older woman stepped forward carefully, her steps deliberate but unafraid, the way someone might approach a deer in the woods, slowly enough not to startle, confidently enough to show she belonged. "I'm Ruth Holloway," she said. "You used to bring me soup when I couldn't leave the house, back when the arthritis got so bad I couldn't button my own coat." The words didn't immediately unlock anything in her mind, but they settled deep in her chest like a stone dropped gently into a well, creating slow, quiet ripples she couldn't yet name. "I don't expect you to remember me," Ruth said, her voice thinning slightly as she smiled with the tenderness of someone who had waited a long time without asking for answers. "But I remember you. You used to laugh like wind through pine trees, low and full, and you never left without asking me what book I was reading." They walked together back to Ruth's house, the porch creaking beneath their weight, the screen door catching on its frame the way it always had, like it was in no hurry to let anyone go. Inside, the living room smelled faintly of lemon polish and thyme, not dust, exactly, but that warm scent that settles into furniture when it's been loved by the same person for too many years to count. The walls were filled with photographs in mismatched frames, most of them slightly crooked from the vibrations of passing trains or the shifting of floorboards, each image like a quiet prayer to people who once filled those rooms with conversation and the clinking of coffee cups. She paused in front of one frame in particular, the photograph more faded than the others, its glass slightly smudged, and felt her knees weaken not from age, but from recognition that came too fast and too deep to prepare for. In the photo, she stood beneath a tree, her arm around Nolan's shoulder, his face half turned toward her in a look of affection so open, so easy, it made something inside her break loose and tremble. But what stopped her cold, what made her take a step back and grip the side of the table, wasn't Nolan's face. It was her own. Not because she didn't recognize it, but because she did. It was her, and yet it wasn't, fuller in the face, eyes wide with joy, hair pulled back with a scarf she could now remember knotting with practiced hands before long walks to the market. She reached out and touched the edge of the frame, her fingertips grazing the wood, and said in a voice barely louder than breath, "That's me." Ruth nodded slowly, stepping beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That was the summer you came back from teaching in Savannah. You brought Nolan a box of letters tied with twine, and I remember because you told me you'd never written anything truer. Tears filled her eyes, not out of pain but from the sudden and overwhelming sensation of being held in place by a past that had once been hers entirely and now returned to her in fragile pieces. She didn't speak for a long time. She just looked at the photo, her breath rising and falling in slow, uneven waves, as if afraid that breathing too hard might scatter the image like dust caught in morning light. Ruth sat slowly on the edge of the couch, motioning for her to join, and when she finally did, Shadow curled quietly beneath the table, his head resting across her feet like he'd finally found the spot he'd been searching for since the day this journey began. "You and Nolan," Ruth said gently, "you were the kind of love people write songs about. Not the loud kind. The kind that sits with you when you're sick and listens to the same story 4 times without telling you you've told it before." She turned toward her then, her voice even softer now. "He doesn't know you're back yet. He doesn't go to town anymore, not much, anyway. Just to the station." "The station?" she asked, the word tumbling out as if carried by something deeper than language. Ruth nodded, folding her hands in her lap. "He goes there every day around 4. Sits on the bench outside the depot with a thermos and a slice of apple pie. Says it's tradition." She sat in silence, letting the words settle over her like the final stitch in a quilt, the last piece falling quietly into place. Then, with a voice filled not with certainty, but with fragile hope, she asked, "What if I go there, and he doesn't see me?" "I've seen you every day," the man said, his voice so low and steady that it felt like it came not just from his throat, but from the long corridor of years behind him. "I just didn't know it was really you." She didn't answer right away, because there was something in the way he looked at her that both comforted and unraveled her, something that carried the weight of longing and the caution of a man who had waited too long to trust his eyes. The old train station hadn't changed much since the photo she'd found days ago. The benches still creaked in the same places, the windows still rattled when a breeze passed through, and the old depot clock above the ticket counter still ticked out time as if it were unaware how slowly hearts can move when they're carrying grief. He sat beneath that clock, just like Ruth had said, with a green thermos resting on the bench beside him and a white paper bag folded neatly in his lap, the corners damp with condensation from the slice of apple pie tucked carefully inside. Shadow moved first, as he always did when it mattered most, not running, not barking, but walking slowly toward the man like he had done it 1,000 times before, tail low, head raised, eyes locked on the one person whose scent seemed to stir something deep inside him. The man's hand, old but steady, reached out before his eyes had even left her face, fingers brushing across the shepherd's ears like a man remembering every chapter of a story he thought he'd lost. She stood just a few steps away, unable to move forward, unable to step back, her hands clenched gently around the quilt she carried in her arms like a shield, like a prayer stitched with more memory than she could hold. His eyes never left her now, even as he said again, "You look like her. You always did in my mind, even when I tried to change the details just enough so it wouldn't hurt so bad." She took a breath, not because she was ready to speak, but because something inside her needed to fill the space between them with more than silence, needed to remind her lungs they still remembered how to breathe in the presence of home. "I don't know what happened," she said softly, the words landing like pebbles on water, rippling outward with questions too large to ask. "Only that I woke up on a train with no name and no memory, holding a photo and a dog who never once let me go." The man nodded slowly, his eyes shining in that specific way men's eyes do when they're too old to cry easily but too tired to hold it back any longer. "I thought you were dead," he whispered, the phrase not bitter, not angry, just gently spoken like something he had rehearsed every day but never truly believed. "Or worse, lost somewhere inside yourself and too far gone to ever come back." She sat beside him then, the quilt still folded between them like a barrier that was also a bridge, and placed it carefully in his lap without a word. His hands shook as he opened it, not from weakness, but from the unbearable familiarity of touching something made by the person who once sat in this very place, back when the world still made sense. He traced the stitching, each square a landmark, each thread a line from the story they once shared, birthdays, Sunday dinners, nights on the porch counting fireflies until the dog barked to be let in. "I thought I was forgetting you," he said, his voice catching slightly, "but I wasn't. I was just learning how to carry the weight without the sound of your voice. She closed her eyes, letting the quilt settle over both their knees now, her shoulder just barely touching his, and said, I found the letters. That made him smile, not broadly, not with any sense of triumph, but with the quiet relief of a man whose words had finally reached the person they were written for. I kept writing, he said. Even after the neighbors told me I should stop, even after the town whispered you'd gone off for good. I just couldn't stop. Not while I still remembered how your name felt in my mouth. She reached for his hand then, not because she had all the answers, but because her fingers remembered his warmth before her mind could place it, and in that contact, something inside her unlocked like a door that had been waiting for the right key all along. They sat that way as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the platform, while trains came and went without them, and people passed by without seeing them, two lives stitched together in the quiet like old fabric finally found and carefully mended. After a long while, she asked the question that had haunted her since the first moment she woke on that train. Do you know why I left? If you're reading this, Nolan said quietly, lifting the journal with both hands as if it were something sacred, then you were already gone. She sat beside him on the old sun-warmed porch of the house they once shared, a place that looked smaller now, though somehow more complete, as though its missing pieces had been scattered across all the towns she'd just passed through and had now returned with her, bit by bit, hidden inside the stitches of a quilt and the loyalty of a dog. The journal had been found beneath a loose floorboard in the back bedroom, tucked beneath a cedar plank that had always creaked when walked upon, but had never been lifted, not even once, in all the years since she vanished from that place without leaving a single goodbye. Shadow lay curled at her feet, his breath slow and steady, his eyes fluttering closed as if, with her finally home, his duty had lessened, though not yet finished, and now he could simply rest a while without fear of what came next. Nolan opened the leather-bound journal slowly, the pages crackling with age, and turned to the first entry, which was dated in the corner with a month she didn't yet remember but a season she somehow felt in her bones, late autumn, when the leaves had already fallen and the days smelled faintly of smoke and something that once made her cry. The handwriting was hers, unmistakably hers, the same soft, steady lines that had once written grocery lists and birthday cards and those little notes she used to tuck into his lunch box when they were still young enough to believe in inside jokes and small gestures. If you're reading this, I was already gone, the first line read, and as Nolan read it aloud, her heart clenched with something deeper than sadness, something closer to understanding, though she didn't yet know of what. I've started forgetting things, the next line said, and I'm scared that soon I won't remember enough to tell you why I left. The words hit like a whisper between heartbeats, so quiet and yet so powerful, and she closed her eyes as they fell into her like seeds long buried in dry earth, now beginning to bloom at last beneath the warmth of his voice. It's not your fault, she had written. And it's not mine either. But there's a storm coming inside my head, and every day it takes something from me, a name, a street, the way home from the market. I can feel it slipping away like mist through my fingers. Her breath caught, held there for a long moment, as if even her lungs were trying to make room for the truth to unfold. Nolan continued reading, slower now, as if the words themselves were heavy and had to be carried with care. I didn't want you to watch me become someone else. I didn't want to become a stranger to the man who always knew the sound of my footsteps before I walked in the room. The sunlight filtered through the trees now, casting dappled patterns across the porch floor, and the breeze carried the scent of cut grass and old wood, and for a moment, it was like time was holding still just for them, allowing this truth to exist in peace, without the ache of blame. So I left, the journal said. I took Shadow, because he wouldn't let me go alone. I didn't know where we were going, only that I had to walk away before I forgot why you loved me. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, the motion slow and deliberate, not to hide the tears but to honor them, as though they were a part of the healing just as much as the words being spoken. The journal trembled slightly in Nolan's hands as he turned another page, his voice softer now, almost reverent. If by some miracle I make it back to you, even in pieces, I hope you'll remember the sound of my laugh, the way I always left the light on in the kitchen, and how I hated going to bed before the story was finished. She looked up then, her eyes meeting his, and for the first time, something clear moved between them, not just recognition, but re-entry, like a missing constellation suddenly appearing in the night sky exactly where it had always been. "I never hated watching you fade," Nolan said, his voice breaking just slightly, "only not being able to walk into the dark with you." She reached for his hand then, both of hers closing around it like a memory made flesh, and they sat in silence for a long moment, the journal open between them, the past no longer something to fear, but something to hold and read together. Shadow stirred, stretching slowly before rising to his feet, turning toward the far end of the yard, where the old path led down to the lake, a place that once held laughter and porch music and summer nights spent counting stars until sleep pulled them gently inside. She watched him walk toward it, slow and certain, and felt something inside her lean in that direction too, like a story nearing its final chapter, though not yet ready to be closed. She looked back at Nolan, her voice shaking now not from fear but from the weight of what had returned. "I need to know what I left behind," she said. "I need to see it all." And in part 10, she will finally walk into the room she forgot, open the drawer she locked, and remember the name that changed everything. "I need to see it all," she had said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with the weight of longing built quietly over years she could no longer count. Nolan didn't speak right away, because some things don't ask for an answer so much as they ask for company, the kind of company that stays when the words run out and the silence starts to speak for itself. They walked together across the porch and into the house, past the old piano with 2 silent keys, past the bookshelf she once dusted every Saturday, past the kitchen table where puzzle pieces still waited in their half-finished constellation, untouched since the day she left without goodbye. Shadow followed close behind, his gait slower now, his steps deliberate, like an old soldier returning to the last battlefield he walked before the war inside her mind began. The back hallway was dim, but not dark, lit softly by the golden hour spilling through windows streaked with rain from last night's storm, casting the kind of light that made dust look like it belonged, like time was visible and settling gently over everything they had once built. They stopped in front of the guest bedroom, though it had never been used for guests, not really, only as a space for quiet, a place for her to write, to read, to be still when the world grew too noisy. The door creaked just slightly as he pushed it open, and there, beside the window with the pale blue curtains she had sewn herself, stood the old oak desk she had claimed the day they moved in, swearing its drawer would hold only the good things, not bills or grocery lists, just the soft stuff that matters. She stepped inside slowly, breathing in the scent of old paper and lavender sachets long since dried, her hand trailing across the desk surface like she was reading its memory through her fingertips. The drawer stuck at first, as it always had, requiring a gentle nudge and a twist of the wrist, a motion her body still remembered, even if her mind had not yet caught up. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue and years of silence, were letters she had written to herself, some unopened, some smudged with tears, all dated in ink that had grown faint but never faded entirely. But beneath them, nestled in the back corner of the drawer, was a small velvet box tied with a single piece of blue yarn, frayed at the ends, soft from handling. Her fingers paused above it, her breath shallow, and Nolan stepped beside her, not to take it, but simply to be near, to hold the space she needed while the last truth finally stepped into the light. She opened the box slowly, the lid giving way with a gentle sigh, and inside was a silver pendant on a worn chain, oval-shaped, etched with initials she hadn't seen in what felt like lifetimes, LP. She stared at it for a long moment, her eyes filling with tears she didn't blink away, her thumb brushing the metal so lightly it barely made a sound. Then, from the deepest well of memory, came a voice, not Nolan's, not hers, but a child's, bright and warm like morning light through lace curtains. "Mama, can I wear your necklace today? Just for the picture." Her knees buckled slightly, and Nolan caught her gently, guiding her to the chair by the desk where she could sit, hands trembling as the name surfaced at last, not in panic, not in confusion, but in something older than time, love. "Lily," she whispered, the word catching in her throat like a prayer half-sung. Her name was Lily. Nolan nodded slowly, his hand resting over hers, steady and warm. "Our daughter," he said. "Born quiet and gone too soon." She closed her eyes as the wave came, not like a crash, but like a tide she could finally stand in, letting it soak her without drowning, letting it carry her all the way back to the porch swing where Lily once napped on her chest and Shadow curled protectively at their feet. I forgot her, she sobbed, the grief blooming now like wildflowers in soil too long left untouched. I forgot her name. But you remembered the pain, Nolan said softly, his voice thick but gentle. Your heart remembered even when your mind couldn't carry it. They sat together in that small room as the sun dipped lower, the light turning golden, then pink, then that soft shade of evening only seen in places where love has lingered long enough to change the color of things. Shadow lay beside them, his head resting on her foot, his body finally at ease, not because the journey was over, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. She reached down and stroked his fur, her hand steady now, her voice calm. You brought me home, she said. Even when I forgot there was one. Nolan handed her the pendant, and she clasped it around her neck, the weight of it not heavy, but grounding, a marker not of grief, but of love remembered. They walked out of the room together, hand in hand, and stepped onto the porch just as the first stars began to appear, tiny and silent, scattered like names remembered only by those who dare to speak them again. And in the hush of that evening, as cicadas hummed and the porch light flickered gently to life, she whispered something only Shadow could hear. I remember who I am now. And for the first time in all the miles they had walked together, the dog closed his eyes not in worry, but in peace, because the story had finally come home. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? It's always a joy to see how far these stories reach. And if this one touched your heart, go ahead and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Until next time, take care.